target neighbouring states, including NATO allies, our allies. Donald Trump trying to wash his hands of NATO, of course. Donald Trump never does anything that doesn't delight Vladimir Putin.
Britain's Secret Service, MI6, is now officially warning that the West is at war with Russia. How did we get here? For years, one man did Vladimir Putin's dirty work for him, Donald Trump. James O'Brien is about to deliver the most brutal autopsy you've ever heard on how Trump's presidency led us to the brink. If you're ready for the truth, show your support by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. And don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss a video. Now, let's watch this together, and then I'll give my 2 cents at the end.
I don't know whether or not you remember the first time you heard from my friend Bill Browder. It was quite possibly on this show, as Bill himself would attest, when he first started campaigning against Vladimir Putin as a consequence of the murder, or at least the killing in prison, of his lawyer Sergei Magnitsky after Sergei uncovered a massive fraud of the Russian people. Bill set himself the task, which he'll continue to pursue for the rest of his life, of holding the Kremlin to account, holding Vladimir Putin to account, and trying his very best to explain to people in the West just what a kleptocratic, murderous regime Putin was presiding over. And at the time, a lot of people didn't want to hear it. Not through particular affinity with the Russian leader, partly through greed. So much Russian money was swilling around London at the time that suggesting we should turn off those particular taps went down very, very poorly in the circles closest to the cash coming out of the taps, up to and including senior politicians. Not of any particular party, although I think it was only the Conservatives who set up a very sort of well-organised Conservative Friends of Russia. There's another example of our double standards in this country in the media. Conservative Friends of Russia. Have a look at some of the names involved with that. Have a look at who went to the party, the launch party, and ask yourself whether they've suffered any consequences whatsoever for hopping into bed at the first opportunity with a regime that is now widely perceived as being our sworn enemy. And that's what today's phone-in is going to be about. Why were we so relaxed about everything? There are some headlines in the news today that, I mean, it's extraordinary that they're both appearing on the same day. Here's the first, right? Frontline is everywhere in fight with Russia, says MI6 head. Britain is already on the front line against Russia and should be ready for President Putin's export of chaos. That's Vladimir Putin, or, of course, if you speak fluent Farage, the politician in the world I admire most. He won't change his methods. This is the head of MI6 giving a speech later today. C is their code name, if you care about such things, not M. I don't know. Is M head of MI5? Or I don't know. Don't at me. Anyway, C is giving a speech later today. Whether or not Q will be there, I do not know, because, of course, if Q was there, they wouldn't let us know anyway. But Blaise Metroelli will say that the front line is everywhere. And this is as a consequence of hybrid warfare, such as disinformation, sabotage, and cyber attacks. I don't know whether you remember Carole Cadwalladr saying we are already at war with Russia some years ago, because she had dug right into the manipulation of our minds on social media. In the original context of Brexit, the original immediate aftermath of Brexit, Carole trying to understand how people from her hometown of Port Talbot, I think, in Wales, could have been persuaded to vote to leave an organisation that had been measurably and brilliantly good for them. There's a question, you know, why? Carole was roundly derided. I remember Andrew Neil calling her a crazy cat lady and not suffering any censure whatsoever from his bosses at the BBC, because anybody who tells you that BBC presenters aren't allowed to hold opinions is lying. You're only forbidden from holding certain opinions. Did Blaise Metroelli used to be Q? Did she? Crikey, is it a he or a she? Anyway, who knows? Blaise, not Belize. just speaking to a screen now in front of me. That's what I'm reduced to. It fits, of course, with the Russian narrative, the idea of speaking to screens, because when Carole Cadwalladr said we're already at war with Russia, people like Andrew Neil attacked her in very misogynistic ways. I wonder whether, now that the head of MI6 is saying we are already at war with Russia, the front line is everywhere in the fight with Russia, people will A, pay a little bit more attention, and B, apologise to Carole. Don't hold your breath for the second bit. Chief Marshal Sir Richard Knighton, the Chief of the Defence Staff, will also deliver a speech today, calling upon the nation to build Britain's resilience in the face of growing threats and uncertainty. These lines, right? Sorry, I'm going to get a bit excitable. How are these lines not landing harder? Listen to this line here, right? Listen to this line here. He will say that the price of peace is increasing and warn of the increased probability of Russia invading a NATO country. Donald Trump trying to wash his hands of NATO, of course. Donald Trump never does anything that doesn't delight Vladimir Putin. Again, is that part of the reason why? Is it because so many people have kind of nailed their colours to Donald Trump's hideous mast that they can't now climb down? Is it linked to Trump? I don't know that it is, actually. I don't think all roads lead to Trump, but certainly Vladimir Putin's increased confidence and threat to the West has been aided and abetted by Donald Trump's policies and behaviour. Of that, no one can argue. So if you'd been one of the people saying, oh, don't worry about what Donald Trump says, just focus on what he does. If you'd been one of the people using Trump derangement syndrome as a description of people who can see the reality, as opposed to a description of people who think that he wasn't a desperate threat to all that we hold dear in the West, then does that stop you from acknowledging the true threat that Vladimir Putin poses? This is the Chief of the Defence Staff in a speech he'll deliver later today. The war in Ukraine shows Putin's willingness to target neighbouring states, including their civilian populations, potentially with such novel and destructive weapons, threatens the whole of NATO, including the UK. Wow. Blaise Metroelli, the first woman to lead the agency, is speaking of aggressive, expansionist and revisionist Russia. This will be delivered from inside MI6 headquarters in Vauxhall. Putin should be in no doubt. Our support is enduring for Ukraine. The pressure we apply on Ukraine's behalf will be sustained. The export of chaos is a feature, not a bug, in the Russian approach to international engagement, and we should be ready for this to continue until Putin is forced to change his calculus. So, one of the reasons why this extraordinary, what would you call it? What's like a word for complacency? Complacency. There you go. That's the word. Inertia is a slightly better word. That was Newton's first law. You know, it came up in a crossword yesterday. This inertia, this complacency. One of the reasons for it, I think, will be this: nobody thinks they've been manipulated. So when Carole was saying, "You don't understand. We're already at war with Russia. Russia is already massively damaging our national interest by encouraging people here to do things against our national interest." Most obviously Brexit. Nobody actually turned around. Nobody thought for a minute that they'd voted to leave the European Union because Vladimir Putin wanted them to. Right? Even when Farage was marching around singing Vladimir Putin's praises to the rooftops, he was still quite a fringe figure. It was only weirdos like me that were pointing out just what a hideous threat he potentially posed to all that we hold dear in the West, just like Donald Trump. You can't be a fanboy, a cheerleader for Vladimir Putin without being a traitor to British interests, without being a traitor to British values, let alone real politics, simple interests, economic interests, military interests. You cannot call Vladimir Putin the politician you admire the most without being diametrically opposed to the British interest. But he wasn't really taken very seriously back then. Of course, he is now. It might be too late to sit up and take notice. But nobody thought that they voted to leave the European Union because of Russian manipulation. I mean, who would? You're going to sit there and go, don't be daft. Oh, yeah, you got me. Oh, flipping Vladimir, eh? That's it. But all of the online chatter, and it's only got worse, not better subsequently, about sovereignty or about, what was it, the EU SSSR, was it? The Fourth Reich. All of this, the rhetoric that spoke to the destruction of the post-war peace across Europe, all of it suited the Kremlin down to the ground. So where they sowed seeds, we may never know. We may never find all of them, all of the bot farms, all of the people appearing on Russia Today to essentially act against the national interest from the right and the left of British politics. After Salisbury, after the killing of Dawn Sturgis, the attempted murder of the Skripals, again, Navalny and Litvinenko, others, all sorts of demonstrations of the fact that Russia is our sworn enemy, and we just sat there twiddling our thumbs, calling Carole Cadwalladr a crazy cat lady, setting up conservative friends of Russia, claiming that it's have we had Putin derangement syndrome yet? We've had Brexit derangement syndrome, we've had Trump derangement syndrome. How long till someone comes up with Putin derangement syndrome? Even as the head of MI6 describes the front line with the fight against Russia as being everywhere. And here's the other headline, which in some ways is more visceral. This might actually hit you harder than a woman, the most senior spy in the country, standing up and describing the threat that Russia is already posing to us. It's a little bit man bites dog, isn't it? Head of MI6 warns against Russia. Listen to this. Germany is to send troops to dig trenches and build anti-tank barriers on Poland's borders with Belarus and Russia. The German Chancellor has said Europe cannot rely on US support to counter Russia as Moscow continues to breach NATO countries' airspace. This starts next April. German soldiers digging trenches on the Russian border with Poland. So, let's just recap, shall we? Point 1, head of MI6 says that the front line is everywhere in the fight against Russia. Point 2, the head of the defence staff, the chief of the defence staff, says that Putin's war in Ukraine shows his willingness to target neighbouring states, including NATO allies, our allies. Point 3, the Germans are digging trenches and building anti-tank barriers on the Polish border with Russia. And here we are, wondering why it's still not landing in the way that it should, and in the way that people like Bill Browder, who is now thankfully very, very, very commonly found appearing on the UK media, but wasn't when he first came onto this show. I think he was on with Lewis yesterday. I think he was on with Lewis Goodall yesterday, warning about what was going to happen. In its simplest terms, the only way Putin gets to hold on to all the money that he's stolen, which is a sum of money that is quite possibly in excess of even Elon Musk's fortune. But the only way in which Vladimir Putin gets to hold on to all the money that he's stolen is by destabilising the West and keeping his own population in a state of perpetual war. That's it. It's that simple. I will be taking no further questions. So, if you're my age or a little bit younger, but certainly if you're older, you grew up with Russia being our sworn enemy. You grew up with the threat of the Cold War. When we did When the Wind Blows, that wonderful Raymond Briggs animation with that incredibly haunting theme tune by David Bowie, it was the Russians that were going to drop nuclear bombs on us. If you remember, and I'm a bit too young for this, the Bay of Pigs, it was the Russians that were threatening Western democracy. If you move into the realms of fiction, when it wasn't Smersh or Spectre, it was the Russians that James Bond was fighting against. It was always the Russians that were the sworn enemy of the West, of Western values, right up to and including Rocky IV. It was a Russian that Rocky had to finally... was it Rocky IV or Rocky III? Rocky III, I think. So I grew up in a world where absolutely everybody was aware of the threat that Russia posed to peace, the 4-minute warning, the Cold War, nuclear proliferation. And then along came Gorbachev, Glasnost, Perestroika, and the end of history, as Francis Fukuyama, the historian, called it. Because when the Cold War was over, the liberal democratic model had prevailed. I guess, you'd have to sort of ignore the existence of China for that to hold. But people managed to do that. And yet here we are now in 2025, nearly in 2026, and those three things are true. The head of MI6 is describing Russia as already being at war with us. The chief of the defense staff is describing the very real possibility of Vladimir Putin invading one of our NATO allies, a NATO country. The Germans are digging trenches on Poland's borders, and Donald Trump, the leader of the, quotes, free world, end quotes, might as well be, if he isn't, he might as well be in Vladimir Putin's pocket. Just think of those four facts and tell me how this happened. 0345 6060 973. In the space of my 53 years on this earth, we have gone from understanding that Russia was the biggest threat to our way of life on this planet, to acknowledging that it wasn't anymore, to failing to notice that it is again. How has this happened? It was Rocky IV, of course. Two tribes, Alan. Two tribes. When two tribes go to war, one is all that you can score. Frankie Goes to Hollywood's famous contribution to military history, not to mention Sting. In Europe and America, you remember Sting? Russians? But Russians! He sang about Russians. He didn't sing... He sang about Russians because that was the yin to our yang, the pole. The opposite pole. Russia was the massive threat to our interests. And that was the Soviet Union. And Putin is in thrall to the legacy. So, how has this happened? And stop and think about this, all right? Or ring me now if you've already got a view. But the question I'm asking is quite acute. We live in a country whose leaders, military and espionage, security, military and security, think that Russia poses an enormous threat to our safety. I'll say that again. We live in a country whose military and security masterminds believe that Russia poses a serious threat to our country. The absolute experts, the people at the very top of the highest tree when it comes to our military capability and our security services. The absolute dons, the most qualified people in the entire country, believe, with a hell of a lot of evidence, that Russia poses an almost unprecedented threat to our security. I'll say that again. The most qualified people in the country. Question: why aren't we more worried? 0345 6060 973. In some ways, the best person to answer this question is somebody who is worried. Someone who's been paying a little bit more attention than the rest of us. But who is that person? Apart from Bill Browder, and to a lesser extent, since I met him, me. And Carole Cadwalladr, and a few other people who were routinely maligned by the sort of journalist who turned up for the launch of the Conservative Friends of Russia party. Why? When the most qualified people in the country, when the biggest experts in the land of experts are united in their view, when the Germans are digging trenches on the Russian border with Poland, why are we not more worried? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Stop sending me Rocky IV. It was Rocky Blummin' IV. I'm trying to do high-level international current affairs analysis. And all you're picking me up on is the fact that I got my Rockies a bit mixed up. And in fact, I got it right the first time. I just didn't have full faith in myself. So, 21 minutes after 11 is the time. Question is really simple. Well, it's not simple at all, is it? The question is simple. What is the answer? Now that all of the planets are aligned, all of the biggest cheeses on this cheese board are all singing from the same hymn sheet. Be afraid, be very afraid of Vladimir Putin and Russia. Why are we not more concerned?
So, what do you think? It's all there. As O'Brien says, of that, no one can argue. Trump's attacks on NATO, his constant praise for Putin, his attempts to blow up the Western alliance, it wasn't just noise, it was policy. It was the green light. He was the feature, not a bug, in Putin's plan to export chaos. The warnings from MI6 today are a direct consequence of the seeds Trump planted. What was the most damning piece of evidence for you? The connection between Trump's anti-NATO rhetoric and Putin's confidence? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure you hit the like and subscribe buttons for more. And don't also forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss a video. Thanks for watching.